Is this thing on? Is this thing on? Can you hear me? Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Console as a podcast. I am talking to you live from my apartment, just as I did before in the video, except now you can just hear my lovely voice. This is the first episode, but of a podcast. However, this is actually episode number 46 of the Console Log. There's no sense in resetting that time and going back in time. We gotta move forward and live on as the future would demand us to. So I'm kind of titling this episode Pushing the Web Forward. I have a nice slew of things to talk about from the past week of news. Hopefully looking forward to painting you a picture of all the exciting things that happened the past week. I'm very excited to hear about your feedback from this, as the podcast is definitely a new endeavor on my behalf. So any thoughts, concerns, questions, debatable topics, I'm always excited to hear about them. And I am going to be curious to see how long this episode's going to be. This is the test run is the real run. I'm not going to have to redo everything over from scratch. I'm just going to try to see what happens, as I usually do. If you've seen the vlog, you'll know that's to be the case. And it's definitely a different experience just talking to myself, even though I have experience talking to myself, as most of the people who know me in real life can attest. But this is definitely going to be much more interesting to not have you see my face and my hands making the fool of me. I think that's enough rambling to begin this episode, and you didn't really come here to hear me ramble. And if you did, well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, because I'm going to be not rambling anymore. With that being said, let's start the show. The first piece of interesting news that I want to share with you on this inaugural episode of the podcast. Oh, it's so exciting to have just a podcast to talk at such length. It's actually kind of a little bit weird to have to be so free, so much space that I can talk about things. And not have to worry about time for a YouTube video. But the first thing I want to talk about is a blog post on the Google Chrome blog titled "A Milestone for Chrome Security, Marking HTTP as Not Secure." And the big deal with this is how 2 years ago, the Chrome team announced that they would eventually mark all sites that are not encrypted with HTTPS as not secure. Currently, up until these recent changes, and that's what this blog post is talking about, that they've actually made these changes be rolled out to all Chrome users. So before this change, when you went to a website that was just HTTP, all you saw next to the URL was a very simple I, like an I for information, and not really giving much information to the end user about the security level of this website. And now with this change, they're actually very clearly spelling out that this site is not secure by having text next to the I that says not secure. And this is, I'm not sure how big of a change this is going to be to the end user, because when I talk to non-tech savvy friends and family, rare do they even know what I'm talking about when I talk about the URL browser. But, it's something that will definitely be a little bit more clear to end users, hopefully, but I don't think it's really going to affect most end-to-end people. I think mostly it's going to affect the web developers that we are every day, that get annoyed by not really having the highest level of security and not having Chrome show our website in the best light. That's really, I think, the target audience that's going to be annoyed the most by this, because my mom's not going to really care that this website says not secure. She's on if I can at least tell her, if she goes to a site that looks like her bank and it says not secure there, that's a pretty good hint that that might not actually be the bank's website. It might actually be a phishing website. So that's actually a nice, easy thing to say over the phone to dear old mom, to not have her bank account credentials stolen, because that's going to be a horrible fall if that were to happen. But this is, moving the web forward, making things more secure. HTTPS is getting easier all the time. There is the free service, I believe, of Let's Encrypt, that lets you actually get a free HTTPS cert to actually make your website have HTTPS. I use Netlify, which does all that for me automatically, which is why if you go to theconsolelog.com, I have a nice pretty green check mark that says secure, and it gives me a nice little warm blanket of security at night, knowing that my website, my static site, is not susceptible to hacking or spoofing by end users, because, oh dear, all that sensitive information that I have on there Gotta make sure that stays nice and safe from malicious static site attackers. And here's some other interesting news. A developer from GitHub, a little website that you may be visiting every so often, announced on Twitter that the team at GitHub is finally finished with removing jQuery from the github.com front end. And what they replaced jQuery with is just native DOM APIs, such as query selector all, fetch for Ajax. They used delegated events for event handling. And they're just leveraging the platform, as people online would say. And that's, it's interesting. I'm not sure. It'll definitely reduce the size of the GitHub page load. It's a nice ideal to strive towards, especially GitHub's website being so old. I can't imagine the amount of work that was required to actually go through and remove all the old usages of jQuery, because if you've ever worked on a legacy application, you know that jQuery can kind of seep into every nook and cranny and get everywhere that you'd want to have it be. Just takes over your website. So, I definitely believe this is a good effort. It's kind of neat to have the modern browsers just do all the things that jQuery used to be required to let you do. It just goes to prove how far we've come along as just a community of web developers, that things that were so bad before jQuery, before you didn't have jQuery, you had to use jQuery, because the pain of just making an Ajax request with the XHR request object was just the worst thing ever. In my personal projects, I don't really use jQuery that much anymore anyways. I honestly can't remember the last time that I used jQuery on a new project. Most of the time I'm just using React and then using just fetch for API calls, and if I need to add any special handling to fetch, I make my own little wrapper around that, because that little amount of boilerplate of making fetch do I want is just as easy it's far easier for me than it would be to go out and get a large library like Axios, which is another a huge library that's a wraparound fetch. I believe it's actually an implementation of the Angular's HTTP request object, just kind of extracted and made a standalone. And it's a pretty powerful library, but it does far too much than I would ever have to worry about. And then for some projects where I'm messing around with GraphQL, I never even have to worry about fetch or Ajax at all. That just is all handled by the Apollo library for me. In any case, I started with GitHub, right? In any case, GitHub, kudos on getting rid of jQuery. I can only imagine that's a good story to tell. If there's anyone out there that knows, anyone that wants to come along the show, talk about that, I'm happy to hear from you, from the horse's mouth, as it were, to actually know what it was involved to free yourself from the shackles of jQuery, which is kind of a very heavy thing to say, because it's not like jQuery is bad. It's large, does a lot, but it's not really a bad thing. But kudos to you, GitHub, for getting rid of jQuery, and also thank you for sharing with us online that you did that as well. That's cool to see. So, moving on from the old history of jQuery to the bleeding edge of web technologies nowadays. Do you know this project called Prepack? Prepack. It's a project from the team at Facebook, those prolific JavaScript engineers. And the tagline for Prepack, if I can pull up the website real fast. Nope, that is the wrong URL. Prepack, their words, is a partial evaluator for JavaScript. In that when you take some JavaScript code and you feed it into Prepack, it can actually execute your JavaScript code as if it was running in the browser, and then take the output of whatever is evaluated and then have that be the output from the Prepack evaluation. So an easy example is you have a program that says 2 plus 2, and you assign it to a variable foo. Rather than having the code that you actually deliver to the browser being const foo equals 2 plus 2, Prepack can take the 2 plus 2 and collapse it down to 4. Now that's a very simple example, but that's kind of the idea of what it does. It actually runs your code to be able to know how your code behaves to then deliver more optimized end results to the browser. And this is a very, very lofty goal, because JavaScript is so dynamic, it can change so much, that to try to actually be able to understand your entire code base without even having type annotations is just, what a task. I've looked at some of the code in here and my eyes instantly glaze over. and that's why I fall asleep every night. No, I'm kidding. But the reason why I'm bringing up Prepack is because a new PR in the Prepack repo caught my eye. The PR is titled LLVM Backend. And it's a very auspicious title that has some amazing implications. Let me explain some terminology. So Prepack lets you, evaluate your JavaScript code. LLVM is a generic compiler that allows you to take static libraries such as Swift, which is one example, or C or C++. LLVM is a platform. It's a platform that programming languages can target, such that you could have Swift compiled to LLVM bytecode, or you could have C++ program compiled onto an LLVM bytecode, and then LLVM can take that bytecode and then compile that to any CPU architecture that you want it to be ran on. So it's this huge abstraction layer. It was written by this person, Chris Latner, who was an Apple engineer. He was the one who actually made Swift originally. But he first had fame of LLVM. The reason why I was impressed when Swift came around was because the person who made LLVM was the one who made Swift, if that checks out. So that's a long way of saying that LLVM is a way to it's an abstraction layer there. You can have compile languages target LLVM bytecode that can then be compiled elsewhere. And this PR on the Prepack repo allows Prepack to target LLVM as a compile to target. And that's, again, a lot of words, but the example they have in the PR is you could run the Prepack program on a JavaScript file, such as filename.js, and you can pass in a flag that says emit LLVM. So what Prepack will do, it'll take your JavaScript code, run it through its own operations, and then what it'll actually output is an LLVM bytecode file. So it'll be called filename.bc for bytecode. And then you can take this bytecode file, pass it into LLVM, and use one of LLVM's compiled to targets, one of them being WebAssembly, and have LLVM then take that bytecode and convert it into a WebAssembly file. And then you have a WebAssembly file that you can run on the browser. So to break that down again, you have Prepack takes a regular JavaScript file, goes through Prepack into an LLVM bytecode file. That file is then ran through LLVM. God, it's so hard to say LLVM. And then what's output is then a WebAssembly file that you can run in the browser. Turtles all the way down. That is just wild. The implications for this are large. Yeah, they're sure large, but this PR is also very much early stages. There's limitations that have been noted in the PR, such as that loops and recursive functions are not allowed. Also, it seems like there is no support for objects as of now for this implementation, which means that the use case for this is not that wide at the moment. This is more of a proof of concept, I think, than anything else, because you can't really have a real JavaScript application without objects, but I mean, just give them time and I'm sure they'll get there. I would love to talk more about Prepack and what this PR is doing. The PR is written by Sebastian Marchbage, which I hope I pronounced correctly, which I probably did not, who has been one of the core engineers in React and just seems like a pretty smart guy from all accounts. So yeah, he's gonna do some good stuff with the Prepack and the LLVM, you know what I'm saying? But yeah, that's some just stuff that if I understood half of the things that was in this PR, I would be knowing half as much as I do right now. And let's stay in the realm of WebAssembly for a little bit. There's another library that I saw this past week called Percy. And this is a library written in Rust that its tagline says it's a modular toolkit for building isomorphic web apps with Rust and WebAssembly. And Rust, if you're not aware, is a lovely new programming language from the folks at Mozilla. It's very robust. People have compared it to be a replacement for C or C++. Like, it's very low level. Go you wouldn't really replace a C application with a Go application. Go has garbage collection. It's a little bit more abstract, whereas Rust is very much as close to the metal as you can get. I'm pretty sure, WebAssembly notwithstanding. But there's this project, Percy, that allows you to, in Rust, write an entirely isomorphic web application. And the code examples on this repo are readable for me as a JavaScript engineer. They have a macro, which is a very powerful abstraction that Rust allows you to kind of do some things that are not really within the Rust typical flow things, but it definitely reminds me a little bit of React in here as well. Things that you can have your HTML in your Rust application, some CSS in Rust, I guess is that point. But again, this application is then compiled down to WebAssembly using tools that do that. I'm not really sure what it is, but if you do like Rust, you do like WebAssembly, you like the DOM, this is the library for you. And then just to finish off this little trifecta of things that are pushing the web forward in ways that I could never have predicted in a million years, there's another project called P6 React. And this is essentially an implementation of React in Perl 6. Remember Perl? That was actually one of the first languages that I hacked around with way back in the day. I ran a forum that was written in Perl, and I had to extend its behavior, and I would just take these little snippets that would change the Perl code. But there was no React back then. That was just what? Oh man, too long ago, in the 90s sometime. But this is Perl with, this is React inside of Perl. Syntax does not look that bad at all. You have component item, things like that. I really have no point to bring this up other than that it's pretty cool. React's kind of eating. It's just cool to see different ways that you can have React in different languages and how the languages can also affect the ways in which the React code can be written. I've dabbled around with the language ReasonML, which also has an implementation of React in that as well. I think I've talked about it in the past as well. And again, the way that you write React-like code, like HTML in JavaScript or HTML in a language, the language itself definitely shapes what it looks like. And it's pretty interesting to see Perl's take on that. I don't really know Perl that well, but I mean, the more you know, the more you can think about. And then, we're talking about React. God, I'm pretty proud of myself the way that I've written this outline. It's flowing quite nicely from one topic to the next, a nice little melody of technical tunes coming to your ears, hopefully things that are interesting to you, things you can actually spend a little more time to learn more on your own, or you let me actually do the learning for you, because my eyes are hungry, my mouth is loud, I'll tell you some things without you making a sound. That was an ad hoc song brought to you by the Console Log's own Harry Wolf. Okay, sorry, that was a complete non sequitur, but that's what you're here for, isn't it? Just my non sequiturs. There was a PR opened on the React repo, everybody's favorite and most loved React framework, talking about trying to open source the React suspense implementation. It seems like the React team's been working on suspense under cover, not really doing it in public, which shame on them. Open source is supposed to be free to everyone, so poo to y'all on the React team. I'm kidding, but I'm sure there's reasons, but I'm just greedy to get my hands on these things. And there's a comment by one of the core maintainers on the React team, this person, ACD Light, responding to other comments, asking about how React Suspense, React Async Rendering is going to be released to the wider community. And I'm reading this comment, and they're talking about how React Suspense is going to be effectively work everywhere on the client, where before they were thinking about how you would have to have your application be strict mode compliant, strict mode in React being using the proper APIs, not doing things that cause React to not know with absolute certainty how your application will behave. Suspense is now going to be supported even without having to worry about that. They're just going to pretty much effectively turn off the suspense, so putting delay milliseconds to 0. Then async rendering will actually have to be working with strict mode. And honestly, I've been talking to friends about this, and I'm just confused by this comment because I was under the impression that React Suspense, React Async Rendering was the same thing. I know there's, they're going to have two state trees simultaneously such that you could have your current state tree of your React application, you're going to have the next state tree where you can apply all these states, and React will maintain these two state trees. And once the next state tree is done, settled, and final, it'll just swap where it's pointing to and point to the new state tree, then have that rendered to the UI all in one go. I guess that must be suspense, because that's suspending the future state of the application. Async rendering, I imagine, has to do with when you throw a promise, and that's a way to actually tell React that you want to have there be async rendering. I guess that does make sense. Now that I'm talking aloud to all you lovely people out there, I think I'm understanding this a little more. But async rendering being the implementation where when you throw a promise in a render function, React will know that there is an async operation going on in that part of your React tree, and it'll actually suspend rendering for that part. So in that way, they work in tandem, such that if you don't have strict mode enabled in your application, suspense will just do delay milliseconds 0, which means that you're just going to see the placeholder immediately, as opposed to waiting a little bit of a timeout before it actually shows that placeholder. That was the big marquee feature of the upcoming React suspense features. Also, in the land of React and state, there is one of my new favorite libraries. If you haven't checked this out before, Immer. I-M-M-E-R. I wish there was a pronunciation guide somewhere where I could understand what this actually was pronounced, but Immer is from the author of MobX, a lovely, powerful, and simple to use, I doubt it's a simple to implement library, but a simple to use state management library. But Immer is a new one that essentially lets you use a mutable API, however it operates on immutable objects, such that if you have a Redux state object and you want to mutate some deeply nested property, you can use Immer to do a simple like state.object.foo equals bananas, and then Immer will, for you, without you having to worry about anything, create a completely new instance of that object, not modifying the previous state object. And the reason why I'm bringing up Immer right now is there's a new release this past week for version 1.5.0, and the neat thing in this release is that Immer can now also record the minimal incremental updates to go from one state to the next and replay, undo, or log those changes. So when you actually make these changes, Immer will actually produce a object. Is it an object or is it an array? It is a object, so you can have an array of objects that tell Immer how it's actually modified the objects. And what's cool about this is that then if you actually want to have what's it called, time machine, like when you go back and forth with your state, you can do that pretty easily because Immer will produce both a patches object and an inverse patches. So if you want to go back in time, you just reapply the inverse patches and you get right back from where you were. And what's also neat about this, if I think about it a little bit further, is that it has some similar hints of what the React team is doing with the suspense of having two different state trees. There's more similarities here to me than dissimilarities. I'm not really sure what that means, but it's just interesting to see where trends are moving on the ecosystem. I mean, this whole concept of having, I'm not going to go into that right now, but Immer 1.5.0, it's a great thing to use with your Redux stores if you want, or just even standalone. It's really, really cool. And then let's just switch gears entirely. I have two last things to finish off this episode with, and we're going to stay in the land of GraphQL. GraphQL, a lovely replacement for all of your REST APIs. There's a new company out in the ecosystem called OneGraph. And the first thing that I find funny about OneGraph is that their blog is using the same framework that React, Babel use. I think it's this library called Docusource written by the team at Facebook. So it's kind of funny to see them just use that as their blogging system to begin with. Makes sense, it's just kind of funny to see. But OneGraph is a company, and their aim is to wrap existing public APIs in GraphQL, which means that they'll take an API such as YouTube or Twitter or things like that and wrap it in a GraphQL API. They have an example on their blog post about how you can actually retrieve a YouTube video, passing in as an argument the ID of the video, asking for a certain properties on that response. And it's kind of just an interesting idea. It's definitely they're getting started off the ground. It's neat. I've seen some open source projects do this as well, but to have to not worry about doing it yourself is pretty nice. They have a Stripe API that they also are wrapping as well. And if you're already bought into the GraphQL ecosystem, this is definitely a thing that will make your experience a lot easier. And then something else that was really cool, I've been hearing about it for a while, and then finally this new blog post from Apollo, Apollo being a GraphQL implementation from the Meteor team, Meteor if you remember them, they have a new blog post called Introducing @defer in Apollo Server. And this definitely reminds me of React Suspense in some ways, because this @defer is an annotation that you can add to your GraphQL queries. And what it does is that when you annotate a part of a GraphQL query request with @defer, you're telling the GraphQL server that this part of the data doesn't need to be returned to the client right away. So for example, if you have I think the new GitHub, have you tried the new GitHub beta homepage? If you haven't, I think usually there's a little upsell button that you can try to opt into it. But the neatest thing about this new GitHub page is that when you load it, everything loads pretty much from the server on the left side and the right side. However, the center part, which is like your customized feed of activity, is actually loaded asynchronously. And I imagine that's done because that's part of the website that is actually the most expensive to calculate. So doing it on demand is cheaper for GitHub to do. And that's kind of what they're talking about with this @defer annotation, where you could have a GraphQL query that says your repos, like all your current PRs. Then you could also have an object that says your timeline. And the timeline property could be annotated with @defer such that when you make the request, the server will return with the information that is easiest to return immediately, which you can then render. And then once that other data is ready, it'll then return it to the client as well. The main gotcha with this is that it requires both client and server support to actually know how to both make this request, then also needs the server to know how to handle that annotation, to then also know how to return that response to the client. Then also the client library needs to know how to handle that partial response, then that additional patch response. So definitely not an easy thing to do yourself, which is why Apollo has done it for you with the Apollo client and the Apollo server. However, if you are not really able to use a Node.js server, you're kind of out of luck until some other party implements this. It's definitely cool. Definitely, if you're staying in the world of Node and JavaScript, definitely a great thing to use, and definitely makes for a better user experience. However, I'd be curious to see the complexity of introducing this to any other library, like a Java library, perhaps. Okay, that was the culmination of the first Consulog podcast, which is still the Consulog episode number 46. Because I love large numbers, and the higher I can count, the higher I feel. Curious to hear your thoughts. I'm looking to have some comments be able to be done on the website so that the community can be kept around. I think I also might make a Spectrum community as well to get things going there, to have me stay in contact with all you lovely folks out there. Again, I appreciate all the support that you gave me on the YouTube video. That was so endearing to hear. I was so afraid of making that video because it's hard to change things when they're working. So definitely a big step forward, but I appreciate you following me over here. Let me know your thoughts on this episode. Hopefully you learned some things you hadn't learned already, and I will let you, then you will hear from me again next Wednesday, 8 a.m. Eastern Standard T-Rex time. And with that, I say adios, and may your week of coding be as full of console logs as this episode was. Bye.